find healthy ecstasy as opposed to toxic. So Aldous Huxley, again, talked about healthy transcendence and toxic transcendence. We all search for transcendence. We all try to get out of our head, out of our ego, to kind of get some release from that endless chatter in our heads. But we can do that in healthy or unhealthy ways. So Martin Sheen was an alcoholic. He said alcoholism is a misguided search for transcendence. I think Russell Brand would say something very similar about his drug addiction. So can we get healthy ecstasy rather than unhealthy? And when we're asking ourselves that question, we no longer so much look to priests because we hate religious authority and we want to be in control of our own ecstasy. And instead, increasingly, people in Western cultures look to scientists to tell us how to lose control safely, what kinds of ecstasy are good for us or bad for us. So we look to the authority. Scientists have replaced priests in that regard. And there's developed over the last century, really, a kind of science of ecstasy, which sounds a bit paradoxical, a kind of rational, analytical science of ecstatic experience. But that has grown up over the last century. So how can you have a science of ecstasy? Well, there are different ways you can look at ecstatic experience, different levels, 4 different levels. You can look at the neuropsychological, what's going on in St. Francis's brain and his autonomic nervous system, what's going on in his bloodstream, what kind of chemicals are going through his system when he has a moment of ecstasy. Or you could ask St. Francis, what's going on with you? You could ask, that's the phenomenological level, which basically, what does it feel like? So describe to us, St. Francis, what is this moment of ecstasy like? And then we could compare these kinds of accounts. Or we could look at it from a cultural point of view. What is it about St. Francis' moment of ecstasy? Why at that particular moment in history? Why did he have a vision of lady poverty at that particular time, just when there were concerns about corruption around the Vatican? Why the cross? Why this kind of dress? Why did he attract so many followers? So we can use things like anthropology, history, sociology, and the arts to look at the kind of culture. And then there's a 4th level, ontological. Are people really connecting with some kind of God or spirit world, or is it just their imagination? If they are, what is the nature of that spirit world? Is it a Trinitarian God? Is it an animist world? So there are those kind of questions. Now, science doesn't really answer the 4th level, but it can tell us a lot about these other 3, as can the humanities. So William James, really the person who launched this science of ecstasy with his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, in I think it was 1902, very much kind of looking at the phenomenological way. So looking at people's accounts of ecstatic experiences and comparing them and putting them into categories. And he said, look, we can't know for sure if people are connecting to God or spirits, but we can say these kind of experiences happen a lot, and often they're good for people. They lead to what they feel is a more flourishing life. And so, using that phenomenological account, we can compare people's what's called spontaneous spiritual experiences. So that's one of the things I did in my book. Look at people's spontaneous moments. A spontaneous spiritual experience is you're just going down the street, as Philip Pullman was one day. He was walking down the Charing Cross Road, not far from here, in 1969. And suddenly something shifted in his consciousness. And he had a sense that the universe was alive, conscious, and full of purpose. And he felt deeply connected to this animate, intelligent universe. And it lasted for a few hours, and then he came back to ordinary consciousness. And that, he says, affected everything he wrote since then. So it informed, has anyone here read the Dark Materials books? The idea of the universe being intelligent and alive and full of consciousness. And people make sense of these kinds of spontaneous experiences differently. Not everyone necessarily thinks they are proof of God. So, for example, Bertrand Russell, again, was walking down a street, a rationalist philosopher, and he suddenly felt a deep sense of, his heart spilled over with love and sympathy for these strangers around him on the street. He suddenly had a sense of the suffering of our fellow humans and a deep sense of sympathy and love. So weird, just happened. Suddenly he was like, what's going on with me? Why is my heart brimming over with love? And he couldn't rationally make sense of that moment. And he didn't try to. But he says it changed him for the rest of his life. It didn't make him a Christian. He was a committed atheist his whole life, but it turned him from an imperialist into a lifelong pacifist. So people make senses of these sudden, spontaneous moments of ecstasy differently. But the word they often use to describe these experiences when you compare their accounts is connection. People feel like they go beyond their ordinary sense of ego, which is separate, just me here, stuck in my thoughts, worrying about myself, to suddenly very connected to other people, to other beings, to nature, perhaps to the universe. It's a sudden shift in a sense of not just little me, but us, we.